Hello, everyone, and welcome to this latest Sybiz Masterclass series webinar. This one is talking about pricing and costs. Although we flipped it around, we'll talk about costs first and then on to pricing. So those two things are interrelated. You may only be concerned with one of them, but because they are interrelated, it's good to at least have a bit of a grounding as to the other side of the fence. Because they, as I said, are interrelated. So we're going to be covering a lot of content today. And yeah, essentially, I should just emphasize that we're talking about product pricing and costing. So there are other ledgers, I guess, where pricing and costing come into play, like job costing, for example, but we are focusing on the product pricing and costing within this particular webinar. And yeah, there's a lot of concepts that we're covering, and they're just going to be done in a fairly simplified context. But because we are covering numerous topics, it's going to be a little bit crazy, and you'll probably want to sort of come back and rewatch certain sections of this webinar once you've got over your headache, because it's going to be one of those webinars. Yeah, just a general disclaimer: we're providing information, not advice. So we don't know any, your personal circumstances. So we're not giving advice. These are some things that you may want to sort of take on board and talk to your advisors and see if they're worth implementing if we're touching on something that is of interest. And for our customers that are joining us from other jurisdictions that don't have dollars as your base currency, we are going to be talking about pricing and costs. For our convenience, we'll talk about dollars, but that could be euros, pounds, keenas, whatever else. So apologies that we will be talking about dollars, and we'll get straight into it. So in terms of what we'll be covering, we're going to be looking just briefly at the costing methods. We're not going to go into detail there. Looking at how costs are updated, talk a little bit, only very briefly, about controls, and then a few of the quirky things as well. So you may see some weird numbers pop up from time to time, and it's a little bit of a head scratcher, but we'll explain the method in the madness behind some of those quirky things that can occur. So you can get different outcomes from processing the same transaction depending on the preconditions of things like stock levels, etc. So we'll spend a little bit of time on that and work through some examples. And from a pricing point of view, we'll explain the different pricing methods, the hierarchy, so and various different settings and how they interact with the pricing. And we'll look at some of the controls and also how to update prices, the various methods there. And then to sort of tie it all in, as I said, the costs and pricing do interact, and there's no better place to see that with the margins and markups. And we'll finish up with that. So we'll jump straight in. So just the costing methods. This is just introduction rather than getting into detail as to how these work. You can sort of these are regular standard concepts, so if you are interested in drilling into a little bit further, you can just jump on Google and you'll get some good information. But average costing is by far the most popular costing method, and that is what it says on the box. It takes a weighted average of the total cost of the item and divides by the quantity to give you your average. Standard's popular in manufacturing, and for those of you in manufacturing, you'll know all about standard costing and why that's popular. And serial is a precise cost per item. So if you are doing serial tracked items, you are able to attribute a cost exactly to that serial number. And so that's a specialized costing for serial products. And then we have FIFO and LIFO, first in, first out, last in, first out. And they're, I guess, less popular than they were. LIFO is a bit of an outlier, but FIFO was reasonably popular back in the day, but it does require a lot of discipline and doesn't sort of play nicely with some real world scenarios, and hence it's not as popular as it once was. In terms of influences on costs, obviously suppliers come into play, and we'll talk about that in the context of transactions in a moment as well. Last cost is a concept that we'll talk about as well, and that's something that needs a little bit of explanation and comes into play with things like negative stock. Locations also comes into play as well. If you do have multiple warehouse locations, that does come into play. And stock levels in the context of negative stock, that is something, if you do have certain items that you're happy to go into negative, as accountants, we sort of a bit horrified at that concept, but the real world reality is that some goods are being purchased into the organisation. They're sitting there on the floor, but they haven't actually been entered into the system as yet, and you've got a customer there wanting to take them off your hands, and so you're able to sell items before they've been purchased into the system, and hence the negative, the ability to go into negative stock there. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well in terms of some of the quirky stuff that can happen. And supplier special prices, I should just point out, and I'll reiterate this as we talk about them, they're called special prices because it's just a flip side of the customer special prices, but in reality, think of it more as supplier price lists, and that's a good way of controlling your costs throughout the system. And obviously, what a supplier ultimately charges you is what it's going to cost the business. But there are certain things in terms of timing. So you may have inventory items that are delivered into stock and then sold before you actually get the purchase invoice from the supplier. And so there's considerations that we'll need to keep front and center as we go through this webinar as well. Okay, so just touching a little bit on general ledger postings, and this or postings in general is one of the key concepts that you I guess is really good to understand, is that the cost is posted at the time of the purchase delivery, so rather than the invoice. So if you do have stale costs in your system, and let's just say, for example, that you are processing the delivery separate from the invoice, and let's also assume that you haven't actually got the invoice yet and that there's no costing information on the delivery docket that you receive from your supplier, then at that point in time, the system will attribute the cost based on what it knows from what's happened in the past with that particular item, and we'll go through a staggered example in a moment to explain that in more detail. And from a general ledger postings point of view, you do have the periodic method, and also depending on where you sit in the organisation, there's interchangeable terms where you've got your perpetual stock system as well, which goes through and equates to the accrual or matching is another word for it. And essentially the main difference there is that your let's just call it the accrual method, nothing happens in the P&L until the sale occurs. So everything happens in the balance sheet, and then it's only when the sale occurs that you see activity in your profit and loss, with a couple of little exceptions, but generally that's the case. Okay, so just as I said, we'll go through a scenario here as to how the system determines the purchase cost. And there's a few little tweaks in between each of these transactions, which we'll do a screenshot demonstration rather than live software demonstration, because there's a few things that need to be set between each transaction, so much easier to do with screenshots. And so we're just going to be using an average cost item and going through a couple scenarios here. So basically it's the same product, but seen in different lights depending on the circumstances. So we'll just jump in and explain it as we go. So this is a new item that we've created, and the system has a zero last cost, and it's never been purchased before. So the system has absolutely no idea what this item is going to cost you when you first go to purchase it. So of course we have no option but to default the cost to zero. That's just, I guess, the vanilla out of the box experience that you'll have. And essentially, it's best explained in this next slide here. If you attribute a last cost when you create an item, then that is what is used as the default if there's been no purchase history. So it's a good idea to ensure that those last costs are reasonably accurate. And because, as I said, because of the timing of the postings, if you have a situation where you've told the system that the last cost is $100, but you may have set this product up 2 years ago and you've never actually purchased it yet, so that last cost could be quite stale. And so if you have that scenario where the item gets delivered from your supplier, but you don't have the purchase invoice yet, and then you on-sell that item to a customer, the system only knows what it knows at that point in time, so it's going to use the $100 as the cost for that item, and not ultimately what is on the invoice from the supplier. So that's something to be aware of there. And so similarly, this is one that was purchased a couple of years ago, and so what the system does is the system remembers what the item cost last time it was purchased from that supplier. So this can be a bit of a risk, a control risk, if you don't purchase the item all that frequently. So even though the last cost is higher than the previous purchase from that supplier, the previous purchase is deemed to be more accurate than the last cost from that supplier, and therefore that is what is used in this particular scenario. And yeah, just I guess carrying on from that previous example, and this is where the supplier pricing really comes in. So if you do have, and we see this quite often, where you have access to purchase, maybe tens of thousands of products, but you may only have, 5,000 products that regularly rotate through your inventory, and so if in that scenario, it may make sense because you don't necessarily know what a customer is going to be ordering from you, and therefore you don't know what you're going to be ordering from that supplier with tens of thousands of items, then you could have your supplier price list imported into the system, and you can control them by expiry dates and things like that as well. So if you've got that relationship with your suppliers where they can provide you with the price lists, you can import them into the system, and then essentially, if a supplier price exists, that is what the system will use when it determines what to use when you do a new purchase order. So even if that special price is greater than either the last cost of the previous purchase, it's basically saying, okay, well, this is essentially the supplier's up-to-date price list, and that is what we're going to be using. So, and that's the case if you've never purchased before as well, it's still going to be using that supplier price. So again, this is if you are in that scenario where goods are being purchased, delivered into the system, and then on-sold before you get a chance to import the supplier invoice, then it's a good idea to have your supplier prices in the system and kept up to date, because then that's going to give you the most accuracy if you are in that situation where you're selling stuff before you've even got the purchase invoice in the system. So hopefully that example makes sense. And so just to, I guess, summarize that particular scenario. So essentially the cost will look to see if there's a relevant supplier special price. If not, it'll go and see, okay, have we purchased this item from the same supplier previously? And if that's the case, it'll use that. But if not, it's going to go and use the last cost. So last cost is now location specific. So if you update the last cost on a product, that will cascade down to all of the locations. But if you want to tweak it for one particular location, so if one of your warehouses is right next door to one of your suppliers, and you can just get the goods passed over the fence, and they'll do you a deal because you're right next door to them, then that location might have a less last cost than your other locations that aren't so geographically fortunate. So yeah, so just bear that in mind as well, that last cost is location specific. Now we're just in the context of costs, we're just going to touch on manufacturing just very quickly. We did get a few questions about manufacturing come through, which hopefully these slides will answer. And yeah, essentially manufacturing costs, they're dynamic based on a whole range of factors. So the location that you're doing the manufacturing in, and your stock levels, your sub-assemblies, like whether you've got your sub-assemblies pre-manufactured in stock or whether you need to make them, and also the quantity that you're going to be manufacturing. So so I guess the key tip, and this is something that unless you know this, it can be a bit disconcerting from a reporting perspective, but the key tip is to use dummy transactions rather than your reports if you're wanting to sort of have a look at your manufacturing costs, because then you get the ability in that dummy transaction to provide the context and look at different scenarios as well, because you may be able to make that determination as to whether you have sufficient sub-assemblies in stock, whether you want to consume those or make new ones or purchase new ones in. There's all those decisions that you can make. So I guess, just to give a very sort of high level example, this is just a manufacturing issue that we're going to do to make 10 bikes. And if we generate this particular assembly at its recipe, the cost is $3,200. But if we need to make a determination that we want to remake some of the sub-assemblies rather than consume the ones that are already in stock, it's going to cost us $4,200, because there's been a change in the component prices at that base level, and that will roll up into any new sub-assemblies that we make based on those base level components. So you can see there, that's just one thing that we tweak there, the level of the recipe that we're going to be manufacturing, and it had a drastic effect on the costs in doing so. So again, this is a better way than using a report from a manufacturing perspective, because you do get to do all those sort of what if considerations and make that determination as to what is best in that particular circumstance. Okay, in terms of controlling costs, it's good to understand the nature of your various products and things that influence that, whether they're fast moving or slow moving. Slow moving tend to be, by their nature, things that are purchased less frequently, and as a result, it is possible for the system's cost to get stale. Because if it is basing it on the last time you purchased from the supplier, and you only purchase every couple of years, then it's particularly in these inflationary times, it's going to understate the value of that item. Fast moving, not so much of an issue if you're going to be ordering them on a high frequency from the same supplier, then the cost should be reasonably accurate. And also, volatile and static items. So there's certain items that go up and down all the time. There's ones that tend to go up and up, and others that tend to be the same sort of price or the same cost to buy into the organization. And so by understanding the nature of items, it gives you the ability to determine which is the best way to handle those items within the organization. So so essentially, if as I said before, if you've got access to tens of thousands of items from your suppliers and you're not quite sure which ones your customers are going to be ordering from you, then if you have to supply prices in the system, then that gives you the ability to essentially know what those things are going to be costing you when you do get those orders out of the blue for those items. And as I mentioned, processing the inward deliveries, that is where the cost is taken up in the system. So if the cost is inaccurate at that point in time based on what the system knows, then that's all the system's going to be using, because that's all that it knows. It doesn't know what the cost is going to be in 2 weeks' time when the invoice rocks up from your supplier. It only knows what it knows today. And so in terms of your cost control, you will need to consider that in terms of, if you do want really good control on your costs, then you want to make sure that at that point of delivery, the cost that's in the system is as accurate as it possibly can be. Obviously, if you've got systems in place where you don't sell anything until that invoice and delivery has been processed into the system, that's obviously very good control. And you can just deal with the exceptions where occasionally, you might have someone ready to take something out the door that's just been delivered by your suppliers and you haven't had a chance to even process the inward delivery into the system, and you may want to allow negative stock on that item for a short time. But yeah, that's, as I said, we're just giving you information, not giving you advice. These are the things that you need to consider. And as I said, the supplier prices is a good way, the supplier special prices of putting a supplier price list into the system. We do recommend that you break them down if you do have tens of thousands of items, maybe split it into separate price tables. It makes it easier to maintain. Yeah, so that's a little tip there as well. And just for completeness, if you are used to using these, the customer special prices have the ability to set prices for items or discount percentages. Now, the reason we don't have discount percentages or discount option in supplier special prices is that the discount would have a compounding effect where the system would basically say, okay, well, what's the cost that we know at this point in time, and then it would apply the discount, and then you'd process that purchase, and that would then influence the cost of the item. So when you go to process the next purchase, that's going to already have the discount factored in, and then it's going to discount it again and tend towards zero, which would be nice if that was what was happening in real world supply prices, but that's certainly not. So that's why there's no discount option in the supplier special prices. And some of the quirky scenarios, the negative stock quantities and the replenishment cost. And yeah, essentially where this can be quite quirky is if you do sell into negative, the system, while it's in negative, will use the last cost of the item. And so if you have like a last cost of $5, once you hit negative, it's going to start using $5 per unit. So if you have, say, 5 units sold into negative at that $5 last cost, then at that point in time, you're going to have -5 in stock with a value of -25. And then when you replenish, let's just say you buy 10 in and they're now $10 each. Then what happens is the system will essentially pass the origin, so zero quantity and zero value, make sure that both of those points are zero, and then you're going to have a greater cost absorbed into those 5 positive items that you now have in stock. So so you can see some quirky things. We'll talk about that with some visuals a little bit later as well, just to sort of round out that concept. And your manufactured items is another thing that can be a little bit quirky. So if you do have a situation in which you're a manufacturer, but you also have the ability to buy those same products from a supplier already assembled, and you have the same stock code for it, you use it interchangeably, then the first time you go to buy one of those manufactured items from a supplier instead of making it yourself, your last cost is likely going to be zero because you've never bought one before, and it's perhaps something where when you started manufacturing them, you didn't have an inkling that you'd be purchasing them as well. So just something to be mindful of with manufactured items. Generally don't have that last cost, so just be aware of that. The value versus stock value, that's something you may not have noticed before, but we'll work through an example that'll look at a few of these concepts in the context of the value and the stock value. And again, yeah, just as I've mentioned a few times already, because it is something really worth making sure it's reinforced, is the timing of the transaction. So the cost is taken up at the point of delivery, not invoice, and we'll have a look at an example of that in just a moment as well. Non-diminishing products, if you're using those, you can attribute a reporting cost to those. So the important thing about non-diminishing products is that they don't have a typical concept of cost, so they don't post anything to do with cost, but you can say, for my sales reports, I want to attribute a pseudo cost to an item on a line level, and that allows you to do that as well. And we'll just talk a little bit about landed cost as well, and the influence on the ultimate cost of the items, and how that sort of reflects things downstream as well. So let's just talk about the value versus stock value. And yeah, so essentially the stock value is the value that's used in the postings. That's at both the subsidiary ledger level and the general ledger level, so the inventory ledger and the general ledger. And the value is essentially what's keyed in to the transaction on the user interface. And so there can be some differences as to the value and the stock value. And we've got a few examples here. So each of these 5 lines, even though it's the same product, we've sort of tweaked the product and changed the settings of it during this process. So the first example is where we're selling this item started life as a non-diminishing product. And yeah, so essentially, as I mentioned, non-diminishing products have no concept of cost, apart from that pseudo cost for reporting purposes. But in terms of what it actually posts, it always posts 0. So this is where you have that differentiation between the value versus the stock value. So you've essentially entered a value of $5 for this item when you've processed that transaction, but the system's actually used the stock value of 0 because it's a non-diminishing item. And then if we purchase that same item, you get the opposite effect happening. The reason we purchase it is because we needed to get back to 0 if we wanted to change it to a diminishing item, which is what we do at the next step. So next step is, now that this item is diminishing, we flagged it to allow it to go into negative as well. And so we've just sold 1 into negative. So now that it is a diminishing item, we have a stock value as well now. So, and that value is the same. And then we take that diminishing item and we're going to get it back to 0, but at a different cost. So this is that example where we've used the last in cost while we're in negative, but then we've replenished it at $8. So to get back to a situation of 0 value and 0 stock, which is our cumulative run, or our running quantity at that point in time, we need to have a situation where we use a stock value in the system of $5, because it would be pretty stupid to say we've got 0 in stock worth $3. So even though $8 was used in that transaction, the system's only used $5. Excuse me while I take a sip of water. And then the final example there is landed costs, where we're buying 10 in, and even though we're still using that $8 unit cost, we've had a $20 landed cost. So the stock value, the value that's used for posting in the system, is the $100, whereas the value that was actually keyed in at the line level is $80 in total. So again, that was just to sort of summarize why you do get the differences in stock value versus value. So if that's one of those things you've seen in your own system and scratch your head on occasions as to why they differ, that's pretty much the explanations of those reasons. So on with the show. The timing of the cost uptake. So again, this is something that we've already talked about quite a bit, but again, just to emphasize it with the visuals, just to help reinforce. So again, it's using the same item, but different timing of the transaction sequences. So in the first line there, we're doing a purchase delivery. So that's just run of the mill. The purchase delivery is occurring, but then we're actually selling that item before we've got the purchase invoice. So on this occasion, the system, all it knew was that that item was $10 based on what had been stored in the system. And so that has actually been sold before we've got the purchase invoice. And then the purchase invoice, because we've actually already sold that item and we subsequently get an invoice at $12, because that invoice has come in after we've sold the item, the stock no longer exists, so we don't get a chance to update the cost of it. So in essence, the system's basically overstating our profit because we thought this item only cost us $10 at the time we sold it. But in reality, that once we got that supplier invoice at $12, it's cost the business more. So again, this is just to sort of reinforce that message that I've been making. And then if we have a look at doing another purchase delivery, and this time we actually get the purchase invoice into the system before we sell the item. So we actually get 3 transactions shown in the history for this sequence. So we get the original purchase delivery, then the invoice comes in and it's at $12. So we get an extra posting of $2 to the stock value because that item is in stock. So we can increase the cost of that item because it still exists in stock. And then if we sell it after the purchase invoice, then we get the true what it costs the business. So essentially, we've got 2 scenarios there that are exactly the same apart from the timing of when the item is sold in relation to the timing of the purchase invoice being processed into the system. So keeping the examples reasonably high level and simplistic. Hopefully that's enough to sort of reinforce the concept, even though it can be a bit of a head scratcher. And just to reiterate as well that the purchase invoice of the initial delivery, because that had no impact on the cost or the quantity, it doesn't show in the history because it actually hasn't posted anything. Obviously, you can have a look in the invoices section of your product inquiry and see the transaction there, but from a stock history point of view, because it didn't post anything, there was no adjustment to cost or quantity, it doesn't show in history. So that's why we only had 2 transactions showing for the first scenario and then 3 transactions in the second. As far as adjusting costs are concerned, in version 25 we have stock journals, and that's essentially for value rather than quantity adjustments. And so it just allows you, if you do have some stock that you want to write down, you now have a new transaction available to process that once you're on version 25, which will be released later in 2024. And other ways of updating costs is you've got your standard cost update wizard for your standard costed items. The last cost can be updated via import, so you can do that on a location by location basis or the actual product itself. If you do a little bit of both on the same product, it's a good idea to update your product level last cost first, because that'll cascade down to all of the locations, and then you can do your location specific last cost import update, and that will do what you need it to do in that circumstance. But yeah, if you don't have multiple locations, you don't need to worry too much about that. And likewise, if you do have multiple locations and you're not fussed about maintaining last cost at each location, then by all means, if you're updating your last cost, you can do that at the product level instead. So I guess yeah, last cost, if that's another way. If you do know what your supplier prices are, you can update your last cost on the item at that level, and then the system will have that available to it. But again, on that basis, if you are purchasing the same item from the same supplier, the default cost will be the same cost it was last time you purchased from that supplier. Yeah, the supplier special prices is I guess a good way of controlling your costs there, as long as you've got good supplier relationships, and they'll keep you updated with their prices, and you can import them into the system to update them. You can also put date ranges as to their applicability. So if you do have, say, a new price list coming into effect from your suppliers on the 1st of October, there'd be nothing stopping you importing that now and just saying that it doesn't start till the 1st of October, and you can get that all ready rather than frantically try and import it at 11:30 at night on the 30th of September. And yeah, again, another point just to re-emphasize is costs are updated transactionally. So because the system learns the purchase cost as you transact, that's something to be mindful of. And yeah, just to sort of tie that in as well with the example that we saw, even though the system will use the last cost from that supplier, if you do have the supplier prices imported into the system, then it's going to use that as a priority. Okay, on to pricing. And yeah, essentially there's different ways of determining price within Sybiz Vision. I guess the traditional way is your price scales. So you could just purely have price scales in your system and just keep it nice and simple, not worry about any of the other options. But the other options are your special prices, where you can also have quantity breaks. And there's a discount option, which, as I mentioned earlier, that's not part of the supplier special prices, that's just customer special prices. Then there's contract prices as well, and we also have margin-based pricing controls. So again, we've quite a bit to cover in the pricing section, but hopefully not as technical as the costing section. So let's look at the hierarchy of pricing to start with. So we've got that contract pricing, the special pricing, and your price scale pricing. And like we did with the cost, we'll go through a layered scenario and just point out some of the potential pitfalls and things that you need to be wary of in terms of your controls. So we'll just dive into this layered scenario. So this is an item that has been set up and we're selling it to a customer, and that customer has a wholesale price scale, but this particular product doesn't have a price against that price scale. So because there's no relevant price scale, the system will default to a price of 0. Obviously, you get a warning to say, hey, you're trying to sell this thing for 0. Is that really what you want to do? So you get the chance to sort of key in a price at that level, but ideally you'd be wanting it for every combination of customer price scale product, you'd want a price in the system to prevent this from occurring, of having the 0 default price. And so now we've gone and added a price scale for that product that matches the customer's price scale. So we've whacked in a price of 200. So when we go to sell the item, the default price of 200 is picked up from the price scale. So yeah, pretty simple and straightforward there. And now we've gone and added a special price of 220. But because the special price is greater than the customer's price scale price, then the price scale price will win. So it's basically looking at, okay, what is the cheapest price in the system to sell this item to the customer? So that, yeah, I guess just the point to reiterate there is that's a different behavior to the supplier special prices, where basically the supplier price that's taken as gospel. So if one exists, that is what is used. With a customer, it's and I'll contradict this a little bit with as we progress, but generally speaking, the best price wins when you're selling something to a customer, with a little asterisk, which we'll explain in just a moment. So there is the option in debtor defaults to say, I want to always use special prices. So if you do that, then even if the special price is greater than the customer's default price scale price, then the special price will be used. So here's the scenario where it's exactly the same as the previous scenario, except we've gone into the defaults and say, okay, always use the special prices. And so it's used the 220 rather than the 200 on this occasion. And now we've gone and added a contract price of $180, and essentially the contract prices are the king of the castle. And yeah, so in a lot of respects, the contract price is the equivalent of the supplier special price in terms of ruling the roost. And essentially the contract price it doesn't matter whether the price is higher or lower, the contract price always wins. But there is the exception that you can configure a contract to be aware of special prices. So I guess the scenario there is that, yeah, if you have your contract pricing, which generally speaking, if you've got contracts in the system, that they're negotiated prices with key customers that are generally better than your normal prices, but occasionally you might have a big discount sale on where for a short period of time, the actual price to anyone walking in off the street will be less than your contract price. And so you have the ability with the contracts to say, okay, well, if that's a scenario and I don't want to, make my key customer upset, and so I'm just going to say, okay, I want to also consider special prices. So when you do have those short-term promotions, if the special price is less than the contract price, then the special price will be taken up in that scenario. Okay, so as far as pricing is concerned, the contract price takes precedence, but as I said, it can be made special price aware as well. If there is no contract price, then the cheapest applicable price wins, unless you have the always use special prices. So yeah, if you don't have a headache already, yeah, hopefully you won't get one, but yeah, so it's a little bit tricky, but hopefully that's been a good explanation for you. And as I said at the outset, we're covering a lot of concepts, but just at a surface level. So contract pricing might be something you're not aware of. If you did want to know more, you can jump on YouTube and check out, I think it's about a 10-minute clip that explains in a lot more detail, which obviously we don't have time to do that during this particular webinar that's covering so much. In terms of controlling prices, we'll talk about these in a little more detail as we go, but essentially user rights come into play. You can put in constraints using margin-based pricing and set the severity of how you want to enforce that as well. The always use special prices, if you default that on under debtor defaults, that obviously does what it says on the box. So even if the special price is higher than other prices, with the exception, of course, of your contracts. And yeah, the quirk that we just wanted to point out, that's a lot more quirks on the costing side of the fence, but as far as the pricing side of the fence is concerned, it's really just that absence of a price scale that can get you that situation where a price will default to zero if the combination of customer price scale and product doesn't have a price associated with it. So from a user rights perspective, the key user rights that come into play here, you have the ability to do a couple overrides, and obviously if you take those rights away from people, it will prevent them from doing certain things. And then there's certain organisations that are very cost sensitive, so they don't want to have the person actually processing the sales transactions be too aware of what these items cost the business. So you do have the ability to take away their ability to view the gross margin and the margin and markup as well, which we'll get in a moment. And yeah, so just essentially I've revoked all of those user rights that we saw on the previous page, and so we have a situation now where we can't see the margin and markup, and when we get to the price field, it is grayed out, it's read only. So this is someone that, and you'll see also discount is grayed out as well, so it's no point saying, okay, this person can't change the prices if they can just whack a discount in. So so this is basically your retail sale environment, or your counter sales, where it's just, okay, I'm scanning this item and it costs what it costs, and yeah, the person actually processing the transactions has no authority to make any changes to those prices. So that's as tight as it can get, and yeah, now that's not touching on things like breakpoints, which can come into play. You can cater to a lot more different scenarios using things like breakpoints as well. So, but as far as out of the box is concerned, tweaking the user rights can get you down to this experience. So from a price update point of view, you can import and export your price scales and special prices. And I should just point out as well, the price scale import is, or the price import is, or product price import as it's called, that's something that can be a little disconcerting, because some people like the different price scales being in columns, whereas in the way the import works is that the actual price scale code is part of what needs to be imported, and so there's basically one price per row. So if you do have multiple price scales, you will have multiple rows for each product. The reason for that is just you could have dozens of price scales if you wanted to within the system, and so it's just easier from an export import point of view to have something that sort of vertically expands down the page rather than horizontally expands across the page. So it's just an explanation of why it is the way that it is. Special prices can also be imported, and again, just like the supplier special prices, if you know that your price list is going to be changing, or your special prices are going to be changing in October, yeah, you can import them now and set them to start in October, and rather than frantically having to import them at the 11th hour. And updating prices when purchasing as well, we'll have a bit of a look at that, and then we'll just have a brief look at margin-based pricing. We could spend the entire hour looking at margin-based pricing, but we'll just have a brief look at it today. So your margin-based pricing, there's, I guess, yeah, if you're wanting to know a bit more information about this, hit the F1 key on your keyboard when you're on this screen, and you can get information about the margin-based pricing. So there's a couple things that come into play here, where you have your, before we get into the actual price grid down the bottom, you have your minimum markup percentage, and then you have your severity, so you can prevent people from selling items outside of the margins that you've set. And then you have a whole range of abilities here to use markup in your price settings and factor in tolerances and things like that. You can also base the markup on various different cost methods. So it could be, I want to make my prices contained based on the minimum purchase price of that item, or the average cost of that item, or the last purchase, or maximum purchase. So there's all these different combinations where you can sort of protect the business from selling things at too slim a margin. And you can have different settings for the same product on different price scales. So there are so many different combinations that you can put into play here. And yeah, again, as I said, we could spend the entire hour talking about this, but it's just the order of today is just to introduce these concepts, and then you can take them further with your advisors or your business partners if they are of interest to you. So yeah, just at our yeah, I guess taking on the previous example where we have the margin-based pricing, when we go and purchase more of that particular item. So in this sense, we previously purchased them at $8. They're now costing us $10, and so we have some items now that are outside of the range, and we can go to the options tab when we're processing that purchase, go to update sales prices, and make our changes at the point in time where we discover for the first time that that cost to us has increased when we're processing that purchase invoice or purchase document. And so yeah, obviously that's not going to suit every organization, where the person processing the purchases may have nothing to do with prices. So that's someone else's job to do later, and in that case you do have the ability to monitor and change your prices via the utilities menu. You can go to fix out of range prices, and that will give you a whole list of your products and price scales that are currently out of range, and then you can go through and modify them en masse to bring them up to spec. And we'll just now have a bit of a look at margin calculations. So this is, I guess, the combination, as I said at the introduction, where you do have that interaction of costs and prices, and margins is a good way of talking through that. So things that factor into the margin calculations are whether an item is in stock or not, whether it's partially in stock, or if it's not in stock. Standard cost items behave a little bit differently as well. And then one thing just to point out as well is that from version 25, landed costs will be factored in to margin calculations in certain circumstances where it's not currently. So for items that aren't in stock, landed costs will be factored in. So that's just something to point out there. And yeah, just having a look at some of these scenarios where we have slightly different items, but they all have the same costs, but or rather the same price, but different circumstances cause them to display a little bit differently. So so starting with the first line there, we have an item that's in stock. We're going to be selling 2 of those, and the price is 20. Our margin is $16, so on and so forth. So that's nice vanilla scenario. The next is essentially the same item, but it's not in stock. So because it's not in stock, the system uses the last cost of the item, and because the last cost of the item was actually less than the actual cost of the previous item. Sorry, this is nice and confusing. Our gross margin is going to be higher because the system is using last cost because it doesn't know what the next purchase will cost. The next scenario is again the same sort of thing behind the scenes here, where we have an item that's partially in stock. So this item has 1 in stock and we're going to be selling into negative. So it's going to use the actual cost, so that $12 cost of the first item, and then it's going to use the $10 cost being the last cost for the item in negative stock. So we're getting a different gross margin there in that scenario. Standard cost item, again, that's pretty simplistic, where the standard cost is a standard cost, so that's what's used as the basis for the gross margin there. And the final example is where we have a item that's in stock, but there's a landed cost attributed to it as well. So even though the item had the same base cost as the first line example, because we do have a landed cost as well of an extra $3 per item, so $6 in total. So our gross margin with the landed cost is $10 compared to that $16 on the first line there. So again, apologies for, even though we've kept this fairly high level, it does still have that potential for confusion there. So just to reiterate here, so all items had a last cost of $10. All of the in-stock items were purchased at $12. Our final line had an extra $3 per unit of landed cost, and we had a standard cost of $12 for the standard costed item on the fourth line there. So that's the scenarios that we just looked at. So again, things can be a little bit quirky in very similar scenarios. But if the scenario is slightly different, you're going to get a different outcome based on the way the system works. So hopefully that's explained some of those quirky scenarios that you see from time to time. And with that, we've come to the end of the presentation, and yeah, hopefully no one's got a headache after all of that. And as I said, you can review the recording and go back and look at the different sections and yeah, cover those sections again if you need some reinforcement there. And we did have quite a few questions come through the registration process that we dealt with earlier, and I believe we've had some dealt with earlier, meaning we incorporated those particular questions into the presentation itself. But what I might do is just check to see if there are any other questions, and while we do that, just if you are watching the recording, you can, if you do have questions, send them via our website contact form or email sybiz@sybiz.com. If it's more particular circumstances, you may want to discuss with your business partner if you want to implement anything that you've seen today. But we might just check to see if there's any questions that have come through that haven't been answered.
None that haven't been answered, Ben.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that. And yeah, thank you all for your time, whether you've watched live or watched the recording. As I said, you can, even if you have watched live, you can still send questions through our website contact form, and we'll go from there. So thank you for joining us. And our next masterclass webinar is customizations coming up in October. So we hope to see you there. Thank you.